using VMware WorkStation. Okay, so we've talked about this series so far. We've talked about the how we're going to structure the series and how we're going to talk about what the things that we need to learn throughout this series. And one of the things that we talked about was that in order for us to really understand how the high-end version of VMware works, that's the ESX version, we have to understand first of all what the concepts are. And so for this and the next couple of nuggets, we're going to talk about VMware WorkStation. We're going to talk about what it is need to know about VMware WorkStation in order to be successful using the data center version. We're going to talk about the interface. We're going to talk about some configurations. We're going to talk about some workstation and virtual machine configurations because these are the same sorts of configurations inside of Workstation that you'll also be using inside of ESX. Then we're going to talk about snapshots and how you can use virtual machines to create a snapshot in a moment or a shot of a moment in time in that virtual machine, and also how you can convert VMware virtual machines across different versions because you may be interested in different formats or different features and functionality associated with those versions. And then lastly, with this nugget, we're going to talk about the virtual machine files that are on the disk. Each one of the virtual machines that we create, whether it's in Workstation Server or ESX, is going to have a number of files that encapsulate that virtual machine. And we're going to talk about what those files are, how they're used, and why they're interesting and useful to us. So let's go ahead and minimize this and bring up our workstation interface here. And this is VMware Workstation 6.0, and the version differences between 6.0 and some of the previous versions actually add some new features, and we're going to talk about what those new features are. The ability to do P2V inside of Workstation, and also some version updates that are new inside of Workstation 6. Now, what's interesting about Workstation 6 is that Workstation 6 is really a long time in coming. VMware 5.5 and even earlier into 5.0 has been around for a really long period of time, and there's been a lot of updates and changes between 5.5 and 6, and a lot of those has to do with how Workstation uses some of the hardware in your system. There's a little bit better use of that hardware for the purposes of providing that virtualization infrastructure. So let's go ahead and talk about the interface associated with VMware Workstation and what you're going to need to know in order to use it. You'll see here it's just your standard GUI interface, and we have a sidebar here which shows the machines that are powered on and also our favorite systems. And we have a big white blank space here that inside of this white blank space is where our systems are actually going to be imported in and where we can actually manipulate those systems. If we click up here in the edit menu, we can choose preferences and take a look at some of the different preferences that we can choose for our workstation. We have options for workspace here. We can show where our default location is for virtual machines and teams here. We can remember opened tabs between sessions so that when the machines arrive, they'll always have the same tabs showing up here. We can run powered on virtual machines in the background after close. This is an interesting feature because what this allows us to do is bring open VMware Workstation, power on a bunch of virtual machines, and then close down VMware Workstation to use those machines, sort of like services, if you will. We can enable all shared folders by default. Shared folders are the ability for us to share folders from the host to the virtual machine, and we can show the the tray icon down in the menu bar whenever the virtual machines are powered on. Our default hardware compatibility is going to be Workstation 6 because we want to use all of those functions within Workstation 6, and obviously we can check to see if there have been any updates to Workstation itself. We can choose our keyboard and mouse. Typically, if you're using a Windows system that has the VMware tools installed, the keyboard and mouse will automatically grab anytime you drag your mouse into the virtual machine console, the location in here, which I'll show you in just a second. But sometimes, if you either don't have the VMware tools installed, or if you have a non-Microsoft operating system, you may not be able to get your mouse inside and outside of that virtual machine without clicking on the virtual machine itself. We have some hotkeys also. We can do Control-Alt, Control-Shift-Alt for hotkey combinations for whether or not we want to start and stop virtual machines, if we want to pause them, etc. We can choose our display information. Do we want to auto-fit the window? Do we want to auto-fit the guest? This says, okay, do we want to make sure the window for Workstation auto-fits so that it correctly surrounds the VM whenever it gets started. We have the option for automatically upgrading tools the next power on if a new version of VMware tools is available, and that will happen whenever VMware Workstation itself updates. Does this say, okay, go ahead and automatically automatically update the machines when they next power on. This could be a scary thing for you too, because you may not necessarily want to automatically do the VMware Tools upgrade, because that is an intensive thing to do, and it also is a kind of a risky thing to do as well. This memory tab here is really important because this memory tab allows us to choose how much RAM we assign to our virtual machines. Now you'll see here we have reserved memory. How much host RAM should the system be able to reserve for all running virtual machines? This particular system has 4 gigabytes of RAM on it, and we are allowed to reserve up to 3,682 megabytes of that RAM specific to our running virtual machines. Now, once we do that, we also have the ability to balloon, if you will, some additional memory for those virtual machines. We can either say, okay, we're going to allow some of the virtual machine memory to be swapped to disk. This is just like a regular swap file. Or maybe most of the virtual machine memory to be swapped to disk. One very good selection for you to choose, and I suggest that you do this, except in situations where you don't have a lot of RAM on your system, is to choose the top button here, which says fit all virtual machine memory into this reserved RAM. Now, what this prevents you from doing is actually swapping to disk. And anytime you're doing virtualization, that swapping to disk will significantly reduce the performance of your systems. Significantly. Your systems will slow down. It'll be very, very not fun. So may I suggest that you check this top button, again, except in the situation where you're just about out of memory and you need to be able to power on one additional machine. We can choose priority if we are actually grabbed into that virtual machine. If that virtual machine is being worked on at the time, do we want the priority for that virtual machine to raise to high? And this is the system priority, like in Task Manager. Once we ungrab it, do we want it to be low or normal? Do we want to say, okay, if we're not really working on that, do we want to deprioritize our VMs? Now, it's important to know that keeping it at normal, if I have a number of other tasks that I'm currently working on my machine, while I'm using WorkStation, and I have the grab and ungrab set to normal, all the other tasks are going to have the same priority as my virtual machine. So be aware of this. And if you want your virtual machines to get higher priority whenever you're using them, you may want to set that process priority to high so that any other tasks will be deprioritized as you're working inside of your virtual machines. Remember, virtual machines are, again, pretty highly resource intensive. And so anything else like Microsoft Outlook or Office or something may interrupt their performance from actually working. This snapshots button here allows us to take and restore snapshots in the background. Interestingly enough, and this is really just between you and me, but whether I check this box or not, whenever I do a snapshot, I typically just let the snapshot complete before I continue to work, especially when I'm restoring the snapshots. Taking the snapshots you can kind of do and let it work in the background, but the restoration of snapshots, at least in previous versions, has not worked that well because it's trying to rebuild the image as it's working on in the background. And so you can take it or leave it whether or not you want to check this box or not. But this allows you to either take and restore snapshots so you can actually continue to do work while the snapshot is being taken or restored. Okay, our next tab here is devices, and what devices says is, do we want to allow removable media to auto run on the host? And what this says is, if you stick the CD in the drive and it starts to automatically process the auto run information on that CD, whether it's an install or whatnot, that can cause some unexpected behavior in a virtual machine because that virtual machine may have auto run also enabled. And so it's kind of a good idea to actually disable auto run if you're using VMware WorkStation, so that if you put a CD in the drive, your virtual machine that may be running will not automatically begin to process whatever's on that CD. Now you'll notice here it's grayed out is because only users with administrative privileges can change this setting. This item here is grayed out because VMware WorkStation is not running in administrative mode. Lockout allows me to administratively lock out certain components of WorkStation. This may be important for me if I have multiple people using this system. If I enable administrative lockout, I can enable or I can disable the ability for people to create new virtual machines, to edit settings, or manage virtual networks without actually entering in a password. Now this is important because this involves the instance of WorkStation. If I move this virtual machine around to another instance of WorkStation, that's not going to have anything to do with it. So this instance of WorkStation will have this administrative lockout. If you have a number of people that are sharing the same machine, then you may need to do this if you really want to be kind of cautious about what you're allowing your people to do whenever they're working on WorkStation. So those are the things that we can do for WorkStation itself. Now also, in addition to the items that we can do inside of WorkStation, there are some configurations that we will do for individual machines. Let's go ahead and import in an existing VM, and we'll take a look at some of the things that we can do for that existing VM. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize Workstation here, and you'll see here I've got this folder here on the desktop called CBTN ESX Virtual Machines. And in here I've got a number of virtual machines that we're going to be playing with over this entire series of nuggets. The first of which here is this VM nugget. I've also got some template machines in here. I'm going to go into the template machines here. I've got 3 different templates that we'll talk about those later, but just be aware that they're here. I have a Windows 2003 Service Pack 1, I have a Windows XP system, and then I've got this VMware appliance called How Net Works, which we'll talk about in a future nugget. But the one that we want to look at here is this VM nugget. And so in order for me to be able to import in this virtual machine into my VMware instance, it's actually very simple. I just double click the VMX file here. This is the Windows Server 2003 Standard Edition. This is the VMX file. And you'll see here that it's called VMware Configuration File. If I double click this file, the very first thing it's going to do is it's going to pop up VMware. And VMware will now have into it VM Nugget. So this is now the same VMware workstation we were working on before, but now I have this tab showing the virtual machine that we're going to manipulate. Once I have that virtual machine inside of Workstation, I have the option to be able to do a number of things. I can start the machine, I can edit the virtual machine settings, I can right-click over here and choose some more things. I can add that machine to my favorites list, for example, so that it will always be here inside of my favorites. I can also delete it from disk. I can clone it. We'll talk about cloning a little later, etc., etc. What I want to show you as part of this virtual machine are the settings for the virtual machine. Now, we talked about the workstation settings, but also we want to talk about the individual machine settings as well. Now, a virtual machine, you've probably played with this before, but a virtual machine is just like a physical machine. It requires certain hardware. It requires certain hardware, except the only difference is that hardware is virtual. What I like to think about when I think of virtual machines is I like to think of VMware as kind of a proxy. Now, you know what a proxy is, right? A proxy takes internet requests from one place and kind of plays the role of traffic cop, if you will. Yeah, no, you can go. Okay, now you can go. Okay, you go over there, etc., etc. And so VMware is kind of a proxy, but what it proxies, unlike with an internet proxy, what it proxies is hardware requests. So if a virtual machine needs some piece of hardware, VMware will proxy that request to the appropriate physical piece of hardware. And so these are the pieces of hardware inside of our virtual machine that it is actually managing. You'll see here if I click on memory that I have the ability to change the amount of memory. I can dynamically choose how much RAM I associated to that virtual machine. It gives me a recommended minimum and a recommended memory. These have to do with the type of machine that we create. If I created a Windows 2003 image, it knows that that's just the recommended for that particular type of machine. So you can safely ignore these minimums and memory ones in here. Actually, you probably don't want to ignore the minimum because running Windows 2003 and 128 megs sometimes doesn't work that well. But you can safely ignore the recommended memory, and you can put it to essentially whatever amount of memory that you feel that you need in order to perform the work function that you need that machine to do. I also have a CD-ROM in here. This CD-ROM is currently using an ISO image, for example. This allows me to, instead of connecting in a physical CD-ROM drive for the physical drive for this CD-ROM, I can actually use an ISO image. And later on we'll talk about the creating of ISO images and how we can connect ISO images. But if you've played with ISO images before, it's an encapsulation of the files on a CD into a single file. If I wanted, I could also use a physical drive here, and I can either choose the drive that I wanted to connect it to, or just auto-detect it to the first drive that's available to me. I can choose to connect this drive exclusively to this virtual machine and even use legacy emulation. For the most part, you'll probably never use legacy emulation. But this allows me to say, okay, this drive connects exclusively to this virtual machine and no other machine can make use of it while it's being connected. Now you'll see here that we have this connected power on button here. This connected power on button says, okay, I need to actually connect that drive at power on, and that is required in order for me to be able to use this CD-ROM drive to perhaps install an operating system. In our next nugget, we're going to talk about the process of installing an operating system, and we'll be doing this as part of that process. If I click the advanced button here, I get to choose which IDE inside the virtual machine or SCSI device node inside the virtual machine I want to connect that CD-ROM drive to. I have 4 options for IDE. I have a number of options for SCSI here if I choose SCSI as well. This is an IDE drive, so I'm going to choose IDE for this. The hard disk, this is allows me to choose what is the name of the disk file and also some utilities associated with this hard disk. Now, this is not the location where where I actually manipulate the size of the hard disk. I can manipulate it as I create a hard disk resource, but I can't, after I've created that hard disk resource, use this tool to manipulate it. There are other tools that we will use to manipulate it. There are some utilities here. I can defragment the drive, or I can even map the drive into a local drive, for example. Being able to map this virtual disk is a real strength of VMware WorkStation, especially the way it is implemented in WorkStation 6.0, because now it says, okay, for the VMDK file, for the disk file associated with this virtual machine, there are a number of volumes on there. In fact, there are 2 volumes on there. And if I want, I can map that drive to a local drive on my system. This means I don't actually have to worry about getting files on and off the system or using my network to move files on and off the system. If I map it to a local drive on my system, perhaps Z for example, and open it up inside of Windows Explorer, I can actually see that drive and manipulate that drive. Maybe I can put some files on that drive, or maybe I can apply a patch or something like that. So this is a really, really good feature of WorkStation in that it allows me to map that drive locally to my system. Additionally, I can defragment the drive as well. And I want to stop here to talk just a bit about defragmentation. There's a lot of different ways that you can defragment drives inside of virtual machines. And defragmenting the drive here actually defragments the VMDK file, or the file that all of the files that encapsulate that VMDK file. So really, when you're thinking about defragmentation when it comes to hard drives or in virtual machines, you kind of have to do defragmentation in 2 different places. Number one, you have to choose to defragment the files inside of the VMDK file. Remember, the VMDK file is just a big old stack of a bunch of different files that make up that hard drive. Well, those files can become fragmented as the virtual machine operates. Also, my host, as it operates, it can defragment the VMDK file. So I really need to defragment both. I need to defragment the VMDK file on the host's drive, and then I need to defragment the files that make up that VMDK file as well. And if I don't do this, I can end up with some massive, massive double fragmentation, and that double fragmentation will cause my VM to get really, really, really slow. So be aware that defragmentation is really, really important. And from time to time, you may want to go to this utilities checkbox and actually defragment that drive so that you can keep your machines operating at the best and most performance you can possibly get out of them. You'll see, just like CD-ROM, I have the ability to click the advanced button here, and I can choose inside the virtual machine what sort of SCSI device I want to connect that hard drive into. And then I can choose whether or not I want to make that drive independent or not. If I choose to make it independent, I can no longer use snapshots. And we want to use snapshots in most cases, so we want to disable this checkbox for independent. But what this allows me to do is set a disk as permanent, which means that any changes is immediately made to the disk, and I cannot do snapshots. I cannot undo that. If I choose independent and persistent, I may have a slight performance increase associated with doing that. If I choose non-persistent, every time I reboot the system, the machine will revert back to the way it was when I first rebooted it. Now, this is a good idea if I've got maybe a demo environment that I want to hand out to somebody, and every time they boot the system, it starts over again, it starts fresh. But for the most part, you really want to keep it the independent checkbox turned off, because snapshots are a really useful part of making use of VMware. I have the ability to create Ethernet cards. I can create any number of Ethernet cards in my virtual machine, and obviously I need to connect them at power on. There are 4 different types of network connections that I can use inside of my cards, and we'll talk a little bit more when we get into ESX about what those network connections are. But what you need to know for the workstation component of this is that the 4 different types of network connection either number one, allow me to connect my system directly to the physical network. So whatever my network is that I'm connecting to, it will be directly connected to it and be able to interact with all the other systems on my network. I can share the host's IP address and use a form of network address translations to have the host proxy that information. Or I can set a private network that is only shared with the host. So the host and the virtual machines will only be able to connect with each other. A lot of times this host only is used if I'm creating virtual machines that I want to make absolutely sure do not interact with the rest of my network. Maybe I'm creating a piece of software that if it interacts with the rest of the network, it could cause trouble or crash something. So I want to make sure that the network connection doesn't allow it to. Lastly, I can connect specific virtual networks that I can create between machines on the network. And when we start talking about teaming later on, we're going to talk about these specific virtual networks and why you'd want to do that. In a lot of cases, the creation of specific virtual networks is really done so that I can create threads of equipment. Maybe I have proxy device or a firewall device, for example, and then after that is a web device, and another firewall device, and then a database device or something, and I need to connect those networks together to make sure they're isolated. So these are the 4 different network connections. For the most part, we're going to be using bridge network connections through nearly all of the examples inside of this series because it allows us to connect to all the stuff in the outside world. We have a USB controller here as well, which essentially we have the option of whether or not we want to automatically connect new devices or not to it. Note that USB is available inside of WorkStation, but is not available inside of ESX at present with the 3.01 version. So USB is something that we can do in WorkStation, but not in ESX. We have a sound adapter as well that says, okay, go ahead and auto detect. We can either specify the host sound adapter and choose one here, or we can use the default host sound adapter for pushing sound out of our workstation and into our host. And then with the option of choosing how many processors this particular machine will actually connect to. Obviously, if we have only one processor on the host, I can't choose 2 processors. This particular host has 2 processors, so I can choose how many, up to 2 processors that my virtual machines can connect to. Now be aware, if I go and change the number of processors from 1 to 2, and the HAL, the hardware abstraction layer inside of the virtual machine, does not enable for that multi-processor HAL, it's not going to be able to see that second processor. So really moving from 1 to 2 is a 2-step process. The first step is changing from 1 to 2, and the second step is updating the HAL from the uniprocessor HAL to the multi-processor HAL. Once I've done that, once I've enabled all my hardware and created all my hardware, I can click Add if I want and even add additional pieces of hardware into my machine. If I want to add a new hard disk or a floppy drive or another Ethernet adapter, I can even add generic serial and parallel ports or SCSI devices into my virtual machine. A lot of times these serial and parallel ports are really good if you're using the debugging tools inside of Windows and you want to push that debugging information out to a serial port, because by adding a serial port, I can actually point that serial port out to a file or to a named pipe, which lets me see that debugging information. That's one of the real useful tools of WorkStation if you are actually using it for debugging information. If I create a secondary hard disk, you'll see here that I get the option for either using an existing virtual hard disk, creating a new virtual disk, or even using a physical disk. And a lot of cases, if you want to use a physical disk, what this allows me to do is create a direct access to a local hard disk, so that instead of encapsulating the information inside a VMDK file, I'm actually talking directly onto the hard disk. In a lot of cases, you're really not going to use this, but if you do, you will actually create a location that you need to point this to for it to pick up its physical disk information. If we create a new virtual disk, we can click Next here and choose the virtual disk type, whether it's an IDE or a SCSI, and then also that independent mode here. Now, one thing I want to tell you about creating new disk types is that anytime we plan on moving this machine into an ESX environment, that virtual disk type has to be a SCSI. So it's almost a good idea anytime you create any disks whatsoever to always create those virtual disk types as a SCSI disk type. The last thing I get to do here is choose the disk size. Say it's 8 gigs, for example. I can make it 800 gigs, for example. It doesn't matter what I want. If I put it as 800 gigabytes, I can choose not to allocate all the disk space now. So what this says is if I click Allocate All Disk Space Now, I'm essentially creating an empty array. Let's go back to the 8 here. An empty array of 8 gigabytes of all zeros, we'll call it. And then we fill up that empty array with information as we fill up the disk. By allocating that disk space now, we actually speed up the virtual machine performance by quite a bit, but we have to have the disk space available to us. And so moving the disks around is a little harder. It takes a little bit longer. We have to have lots and lots of disk space available to us. If I create, an 8 terabyte disk size and don't click the Allocate All Disk Space now, I'll actually create a very, very small file, but the machine will see it as an 8 terabyte size. So I could potentially use this to sort of test how my machine works with very, very large disk arrays. I can also choose to split the disk into 2 gigabyte files, which is a standard size. Some operating systems have problems, and some file formats have different problems. File systems have problems if you have disk sizes larger than 2 gigabytes in size. And then I give it a name, and that's pretty much finishes it. So I can create a disk file by doing just the same. In the same vein here, I can create CD-ROM drives or floppy drives or Ethernet adapters. When I create Ethernet adapters, I've got to choose the type of network associated with it. Example. So these are the hardware options that I can choose for an existing virtual machine that's already available to me. I want to move over to the Options tab also and show you some of the things that are here in the Options tab. Anytime that I create a virtual machine, obviously I got to give it a name. The name of this virtual machine is VMWare. I have a guest operating system here called Microsoft Windows, and I can choose the version. You'll see I clicked here and it switched it to Microsoft Windows XP Professional. This is actually a Server 2003 Standard Edition. And what this does is this updates the configuration file to give it the specific characteristics that it needs in order to best run that operating system. Obviously, something that's Sun Solaris is going to need different hardware parameters than something that's a Windows Server 2003. I can also choose where my snapshots is going to be stored and whether or not I'll use the enhanced virtual keyboard. I can select power information to choose how I want my power information to be. I can say, okay, after opening the virtual machine, go ahead and power it on or enter virtual full screen mode. And also the VCR controls here, how I want my VCR controls to work. Is the red VCR button a shutdown or a power off? Is the pause button suspend or suspend guest? Example. Power on, reset. This allows me to change how these little buttons up here in the corner, what those have to do with this particular virtual machine. Do I want to enable shared folders? I showed you just a second ago how we could map folders from the virtual machine into a physical drive on the host. I can also create what are called folder shares. So if I enable folder shares, I can say, okay, once I know what my share is going to be, let's call it my share, I can create a location on the host, let's say at the desktop here, where I want my system, the virtual machine files to be able to go. So it's not really mapping the drive of the virtual machine so much as instead creating a location on my host where I can drop off information and then pick it up inside the virtual machine. So it's really the same but kind of different. So this is the concept of folder sharing. One thing that I think you'll enjoy about folder sharing is specifically whenever you are using virtual machines that are host-only networking or no networking, you don't really have a good way of getting folders and files in and out of that machine, and so shared folders really make that a much easier way of doing things. I'm going to go ahead and remove this here and set that back to disabled for now. In terms of snapshot and replay, do I want to disable snapshots? Do I want to revert or take snapshots at power off? And do I want to enable replay, which is allows me to replay the execution of a series of commands that I've done? And then this is something new that's with WorkStation 6.0, and that's why it's listed as experimental. In terms of guest isolation, this is another function which allows me to move files in and out and copy and paste in and out of my virtual machine. This guest isolation doesn't work with all operating systems. It tends to work really well with Windows operating systems and not very well with other operating systems, but allows me to drag and drop files and folders from the host into the virtual machine, and also have a shared clipboard between my host and my virtual machine as well. Do I want to automatically upgrade the VMware tools? Do I want to manually upgrade the VMware tools? VMware tools are important because it adds the ability for all of these shared folders and this snapshot and this guest isolation and grabbing and dragging and dropping, and allows all these things to operate. And it also significantly speeds up the processing of the virtual machine. So anytime that you create a virtual machine, and we'll talk about this when we create new virtual machines in the next nugget, you need to make sure that you install those VMware tools as soon as possible. Remote display, do I want to enable a VNC client to actually enable this virtual machine remotely? This is a new feature inside of VMware WorkStation 6.0. Do I have a standard port? Do I have a password? Do I have confirmation, for example? This is really helpful if I'm using WorkStation in service mode. That's back to that whole idea of leaving the machines up even after WorkStation is powered off in service mode so that other machines can connect in. So you could term serve into machines, but not all operating systems have terminal services, and sometimes you want to be right on the host. So enabling this allows a VNC client to access that virtual machine. Appliance view is kind of a gee whiz way if I want to create a virtual machine as an appliance, or essentially as a single function device. If I want to set up this device so that it, when it appears, when it first gets launched, it shows some information with a logo and the author and a display name and a version, etc. It allows me to enable this view so the machine feels more like an appliance and less like I'm logging into the console. So if I do that, if I enable appliance view and switch to appliance view at power on, that allows me to set this up so I don't get my standard default console view whenever I power on the virtual machine. Lastly, advanced here is that old process priority thing that we talked about before. The previous setting for process priority would actually configure that for all virtual machines that we brought into. It was kind of the default setting for all of our virtual machines. This process priority, as with all of these settings, is for this particular virtual machine only. Under gather debugging information, if you are really interested in slowing down your virtual machine so as to make it almost unusable, you can enable debugging information, which actually performs some debugging and outputs debugging information as you're running the virtual machine. It's useful if you're trying to figure out what's wrong with the virtual machine, but do not use this in any kind of production sense. Same thing with disabling acceleration or page trimming or log virtual machine progress example. Whenever you're doing this, this is good for debugging information, maybe not so good for actually production use. If you enable template mode, this is another fancy feature for saying I want to make this virtual machine read-only. And so once I enable template mode, I'm not able to make any manipulations to that virtual machine because now this virtual machine is a template that I use to migrate to other, to clone to other machines or to copy to other locations. So anytime you enable template mode, just assume that you've kind of got all the settings here set just the way you want them, and you don't want to muck with them after that. And lastly, we have down here file locations. So these are all the configurations that we can choose for this virtual machine. Once we've configured the virtual machine the way that we want, we're ready to go, we can click the Start This Virtual Machine button, and you'll see here that we boot into our BIOS. We see the VMware BIOS there, and very shortly we'll actually see the Windows 2003 logo appear, and there it is right there. This, because we're doing 800 by 600, we're going to see only part of the screen here, so you'll have to bear with me when we're dragging and dropping inside of the virtual machine. But this machine is now going to boot just like a Windows server. You'll see here the Windows starting up. We're going to connect to network connections. We're going to talk to our domain controller, et cetera, et cetera. And once the startup is complete, we'll actually be able to log on to this Windows server just like we would any sort of Windows server on our network. This is very similar to the Windows server installation that we normally do. If I click here inside of the virtual machine now, my cursor moves down and I'm now inside of the virtual machine. One keystroke that I still to this day forget, and I think you probably will too, is that when it tells you to hit Control-Alt-Delete to begin inside of a virtual machine, the keystroke is actually Control-Alt-Insert. When you hit Control-Alt-Delete, it is captured by your host machine, and your host machine goes to the security screen. And so we had to remap Control-Alt-Delete to Control-Alt-Insert for virtual machines so that it wouldn't get captured by that keystroke wouldn't get captured by the host machine. I can log in my password here, and bam, I'm logged into my Windows Server box, and then we're all happy and ready to go. So this is the configuration of the virtual machine. Now, before I go any farther, let's talk a little bit about what we've actually done with this configuration. I'm going to go ahead and minimize WorkStation here, and you'll see here that I've got the files open up for the virtual machine that we're actually working on right now. And there are a number of new files that are appearing actually as well. You'll see here that there's this Windows Server 2003 Standard Edition. This is the configuration file that we talked about before. We also have a VMXF file, a VMSD file, an NVRAM file, and this VMDK file right here, this virtual disk file. We have a number of text files here, and then we've got all these text files, this vmem and lock files up here. Now, what are these files? These files are used for particular things inside of our virtual machine. First of all, the easiest one here are these VMware text documents. If I double-click this VMware text document, you'll see that it opens up Notepad. This is the log file, if you will, of our virtual machine. And the log file is set by date and time, so I can show when something occurred in my virtual machine, what happened, and whether or not it functioned correctly or not. Here I'm referencing vCPU 0. This is a VMX file that we've actually changed here. Socket 1 client closed connection on this. I'm registering memory space here to lock that memory space in for use of the virtual machine. There are a number of different VMware files. Here's VMware 0, which is a little bit further back, and VMware 1 and VMware 2. So this actually goes further backwards in time, if you will. So as I'm using the virtual machine, it will push that information back through VMware 0, VMware 1, and VMware 2 so I can see more information. The VMDK file right here, the virtual disk file, is actually the file that contains all the data. That's the hard drive of the virtual machine. The NVRAM file is really the BIOS of the machine. That's the when we first booted the machine, you saw that VMware logo pop up. That's actually the BIOS that bootstraps the machine to get it started. This VMSD file is a centralized file for storing information and metadata about snapshots. We're going to talk about snapshots here in a second. And anytime we create snapshots, this VMSD file gets populated with more information. This VMXF file is kind of a supplemental configuration file file for virtual machines once you've created a team. Whenever you create that team, this VMXF file gets created. And if you remove a machine from a team, that VMXF file actually stays resident. So it's really an unnecessary file if you don't have your machines inside of a team. This vmem file is a very large file. You'll see here this file is a gigabyte in size. And this file actually gets instantly created, bam, instantly created whenever I power on the machine. And what this does is as soon as we power on the machine, it automatically reserves a space equal to the size of the RAM that I need. So you'll see here I requested a gig of RAM for the virtual machine, and here's a gig of RAM for this vmem file. These are some lock files that allow me to do snapshotting and some other stuff associated with locking the virtual machine, doing transactional information on the virtual machine. But these are the files that make up my virtual machine. The only one, and we'll talk about this in the next nugget, the only one that we actually really need to keep around is this one, the virtual disk file, and potentially this one, the VMware configuration file. In the next nugget, we're going to talk about what that configuration file looks like and how we can manipulate the file itself to make some interesting changes as well. So let's go back to our virtual machine. Here we are back on our virtual machine again. And the last thing we want to talk about, there are two things. One is VMware versioning, and that's versioning of the virtual machine itself, and then also snapshots. And I think you're going to like snapshots quite a bit. So the first thing I want to talk about is actually snapshots. And it's very interesting to talk about snapshots with the VM powered on because it gives me the chance to show you what these snapshots do. If I click under VM and I click on snapshot and go to the snapshot manager, you'll see that we get this nice map associated with the number of snapshots on my system. So what I see here is this VM nugget, and it shows you are here. Now, I want you to stop and think about this. I'm an old fan of the movie Back to the Future. And if you remember in Back to the Future Part 2, where Doc and Marty are sitting in the alternate present, and they're trying to talk about how Biff Tannen has taken over time, and they show this timeline where time goes from left to right, and then there's this branch on time that says, okay, well, we've actually branched, and we're now in a new time, and we've got to get back to the past so that we can get back to the future. Well, this is sort of the VMware version of that Back to the Future, Back to the Past timeline that Doc and Marty actually figured out. What I can do is if I take a snapshot of my machine at this location, let's say I'm initial configuration complete, I can create this snapshot. It will begin the process, and now you'll see I'm beginning to create this timeline associated with the virtual machine that I'm created. I'm saving the virtual machine state down here. You'll see down here at the very bottom, I'm 17% complete with saving that virtual machine state. Once that virtual machine state gets to 100%, then I can potentially create another snapshot if I want. Let me go ahead and close this. If I go back here to properties, and let's say I want to change the desktop, so the desktop is a different color, for example. See, instead of that, I'll put on the nice the mountain background here, and I think that's Rainier, whatever mountain it is. So I've made a change to my machine, and once I'm through making a change to my machine, I can create another snapshot so I can show how I can move backwards and forwards through time to actually make, let's say I wanted to go backwards in time because I made an oops, or maybe I wanted to see how something else did. The snapshot manager allows me to do that. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording really quick while we wait for this virtual machine state to complete. When we get back, we're going to revert back to our old snapshot. And we're done. If I go back to VMware and back to the Snapshot Manager, we'll see that an initial configuration complete snapshot's been created, and we now have our timeline. This is our Doc and Marty timeline that we talked about. And now we're here. We're adding now to that initial configuration. If I want to revert back to that initial configuration, I can do so by clicking on the initial configuration and saying go to. You'll see down here is a little picture associated with that initial configuration. Here is our screenshot as it stands now. You'll see no screenshots available because we haven't taken another snapshot. But if I click here, now I don't have the mountain anymore. I have the little blue screen. If I click go to, my current state will be lost, and I can go back to that initial configuration. What I want to show you, though, is how we can create branches in our timeline. So let's say I'm here again, and I want to take a second snapshot. This is our second snapshot here. I'm going to go ahead now and create that second snapshot. And as that second snapshot is creating, then once we've said, okay, where we've got our second snapshot now. This is now where we've got our little mountain picture. But instead, I want to say, well, maybe that wasn't the timeline that I wanted to go down. Maybe I want to create a branch in that timeline. Let's go ahead and show how we'll do that. Now, in order for me to do that, again, I have to wait for this virtual machine state to complete. So I'm going to pause again while we wait for this state to complete. One thing you'll notice about creating snapshots is that no matter how fast your hardware host is that the snapshots take a really long time to take and a rather long time to restore as well, too. So just be aware that it's going to take you a while whenever you're using these snapshots. So let's go ahead and pause it, and we'll come back as soon as this completes. Okay, and we're back. We've got our two snapshots here that we created, the initial configuration and the second snapshot, and the initial configuration's got the blank screen. If I go back to this initial configuration, I will lose the You Are Here button, and now I've created the branch. Because I'm I'm starting from a different position, I'm actually now creating changes and moving the You Are Here button to a branch in our snapshot manager. You'll see here now that I'm restoring the virtual machine state because I've got background restore actually functioning. I can potentially do a little bit of work in here while the virtual machine state is being restored. But if I go back to my snapshot manager, you'll see now that I've created two branches. And at any point in time, I can move around inside of those branches or even take more snapshots if I want to see my configuration at various points. So the very last thing we want to talk about today is actually versions. And in order to do versions, we actually have to power off this virtual machine. We're going to go ahead and power this virtual machine off so we can use it. Go back to the VM tab here, and we're going to go look at upgrade or change version here. When we do this, this allows us to change the version of VMware that this particular machine is compatible with. Currently, this is a Workstation 6 image, and the Workstation 6 image has certain limitations and certain compatible products associated with it. If I'm trying to move my virtual machines backwards and forwards between Workstation and Server and ESX and ACE and Fusion and all of those, sometimes I may have to actually backport the version of VMware to a version that is more compatible if I need to move it from one product to the other. You'll see here there's some limitations, 8 gig memory limit, 2 processor limits, for example. If I backport it to version 5, now I can import it into Server 1.x. I have a lower memory limit, a lower Ethernet adapter limit, no USB, for example. If I move it back to Workstation 4, now I can move it into GSX Server, for example, and other versions of Workstation. The only time you're ever really going to do this is one, if you have an older version of VMware that you need to upgrade to the newest version of Workstation, or if you have a brand new version of Workstation and you need to move it to a different type of VMware product. Maybe it's GSX or Server or ACE or something like that. So be aware that this change of version wizard is out there, and it allows you to change the version of the file so that you can make manipulations and get that migration going if you're moving it from and to and from different products. So what have we talked about today? We talked about VMware Workstation. We've talked about the interface of VMware Workstation and also how to configure not only Workstation itself, but also the virtual machines inside of Workstations. We talked about snapshots. We talked about versions. And then we also spent a little bit of time talking about the virtual machine files that are actually on the disk that make up our VMware Workstation. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.